The Duke of Blackwood, a man for whom precision was a form of worship, delivered the instruction to his butler with the same dispassionate clarity he used to dictate letters to his solicitor. "Regarding the new Duchess, Mr. Hobbs," he said, his gaze fixed on a folio of architectural drawings spread across the vast mahogany desk. "Her suites are prepared. She will have the run of the house and the gardens, but she is not to enter the library under any circumstances. See to it." Mr. Hobbs, who had served the Blackwood Dukes for 40 years, received the order with a stillness that was its own form of commentary. "Very good, Your Grace." Alistair did not look up. The library was not merely a room. It was the granite fortress of his mind, the silent repository of his lineage, and the sole chamber in Blackwood Manor where he was not the Duke, but simply himself. It was a space of intellectual order, of quiet contemplation, of masculine solitude. It was not a place for a wife, especially not this wife, a woman chosen for her placid temperament and unremarkable lineage, a convenient solution to the tiresome problem of the succession. He had reviewed the details of Miss Eleanor Vance as one might review the pedigree of a broodmare. An orphan of a country gentleman whose finances had collapsed upon his death. Reputedly quiet, tolerably educated, though not in any way that might prove disruptive. Plain, but not distressingly so. She was, in short, a blank canvas upon which the duties of a duchess could be painted without resistance. She would produce an heir, manage the household accounts with quiet competence, and fade gracefully into the background of his well-ordered life. She would not, he was certain, have any use for a library containing one of the finest private collections of classical and scientific texts in England. The order was not an act of cruelty. It was an act of efficiency. It was a boundary drawn to preserve the sanctity of his work and his peace. It was a lock on a door she would likely never think to open. 200 miles away, Eleanor Vance was packing the remnants of her life into 3 wooden trunks. The grand house of her youth had been sold, its contents auctioned to satisfy her late father's creditors. All that remained were her clothes, a few personal effects, and the things that truly mattered. She handled them with a reverence that bordered on sorrow, a worn copy of Ovid's Metamorphoses in the original Latin, a slim volume of her own botanical sketches, the petals and leaves rendered with a scientist's precision and an artist's eye, a folio of her father's notes on celestial navigation. These were not mere objects. They were the architecture of her own private library, the one she carried inside her skull. She was not a fool. She understood the nature of the transaction that was about to take place. She was a debt being settled, a name being saved from ruin in exchange for her womb and her compliance. The Duke of Blackwood had not courted her. His solicitor had negotiated for her. She had seen him only once, at the signing of the marriage contracts. He had been tall, impeccably dressed, and possessed of a cool, analytical gaze that seemed to catalogue her features without truly seeing them. He had spoken of duty, of legacy, of the practicalities of their union. He had not spoken of affection or companionship or happiness. Her aunt, Mrs. Croft, a woman whose pragmatism was as sharp as her elbows, had called it a magnificent opportunity. "You will be a duchess, Eleanor. You will have security, position, everything a woman could desire." Eleanor had not argued. She knew what a woman without fortune or powerful connections could expect from the world, and it was not magnificent. This marriage was a harbor, albeit a cold and unfamiliar one. She would be safe. She would be solvent. But as she wrapped her father's notes in oilcloth, a quiet, internal door closed. She would be the Duchess of Blackwood. She would perform her duties. She would be what he had purchased, a quiet, biddable, unobtrusive wife. The rest of her, the part that debated with Ovid and charted the stars, would be packed away as carefully as her books, stored in a place he would never think to look. Their wedding was an exercise in solemn efficiency. It took place in a cold London church, attended by a sparse collection of relatives who seemed more interested in the ducal crest on the carriage than in the bride herself. Alistair was a model of aristocratic restraint, his vows delivered in a clear, steady voice that betrayed no emotion whatsoever. Eleanor, veiled and silent, made her own responses in a voice so low it was nearly lost in the cavernous space. The journey to Blackwood Manor was conducted in near total silence. The Duke read a political treatise, his focus absolute. Eleanor watched the rolling countryside blur past the window, a landscape as foreign to her as the man sitting opposite. She was present, and she was absent. She was there, and she was not there. She was already practicing the art of invisibility. Blackwood Manor rose from the landscape not as a home, but as a statement. It was a vast, imposing edifice of gray stone, perfectly symmetrical, relentlessly grand. It was a house that valued order over comfort, legacy over life. As the carriage drew to a halt, a line of servants appeared, marshaled by the formidable figure of Mr. Hobbs. Alistair finally set aside his book. "Mr. Hobbs will show you to your suites. They are in the East Wing. I reside in the West. We shall dine at 8. I trust you will find everything satisfactory." It was not a question. It was a statement of fact. Eleanor inclined her head. "Thank you, Your Grace." Her rooms were magnificent. A sitting room, a dressing room, a bedroom, all decorated in shades of cream and pale blue, impeccably clean and profoundly impersonal. They felt like the guest rooms of a grand hotel. A fire had been laid in the grate, but it offered little warmth against the chill of the welcome. For the first few weeks, she moved through the house like a phantom. She learned the servants' names, reviewed the menus with the cook, and inspected the linen closets. She did everything that was expected of her, and she did it with a quiet competence that was beyond reproach. She was a perfect duchess. She was a perfect stranger. Alistair observed her from a distance, and what he saw satisfied him. She was precisely what he had anticipated. She was quiet at meals, her contributions to conversation brief and appropriate. She managed the staff without fuss. She made no demands on his time or his attention. The arrangement was working perfectly. His life, his work, his sacrosanct solitude remained undisturbed. He would retire to his library after dinner, and she would withdraw to her rooms or the drawing room, where the distant, melancholy notes of a pianoforte sometimes drifted down the corridor. The sound was pleasant enough, a minor and unobtrusive addition to the evening's silence. The first crack in his carefully constructed perception appeared a month into their marriage. He had invited a fellow of the Royal Society to dinner, a Professor Albright, a man whose chief characteristics were a booming voice and a profound self-satisfaction with his own intellect. The topic, inevitably, turned to Albright's latest passion, the classification of exotic flora. "I am preparing a monograph on the Orchidaceae family," Albright announced, pontificating to the table at large. Specifically, the work of the German botanist Hoffmann, whose treatise on the subject is, of course, the definitive text. He argues, quite convincingly, that the pollination mechanism of the Cypripedium is entirely dependent on a single species of beetle. Alistair nodded, feigning an interest he did not feel. His gaze drifted to his wife. She was listening, her head tilted slightly, a small, still point of silence in the storm of Albright's monologue. An understandable conclusion, given the specimens available to him at the time, a quiet voice said. The table fell silent. Professor Albright blinked, his monologue interrupted. Alistair stared at Eleanor. She had not looked up from her plate, but the words had, unmistakably, come from her. Albright cleared his throat. "I beg your pardon, Your Grace?" Eleanor raised her eyes. They were clear, direct, and startlingly intelligent. Hoffman's conclusion. It was understandable, but it was incorrect. He was working from dried, imported specimens. Had he been able to observe the Cypripedium accal in its native habitat, as the American naturalist John Bartram later did, he would have noted that its primary pollinator is, in fact, a species of solitary bee, not a beetle. She took a small sip of water. Bartram's correspondence on the matter is quite clear. It is a common misconception. A profound, astonished silence descended upon the dining room. Professor Albright's face cycled through a series of colors, from ruddy to pale. Alistair felt a strange, unfamiliar sensation, a mixture of irritation and a grudging, startling flicker of interest. He had expected silence from this woman. He had contracted for it. This quiet display of erudition was an unforeseen variable. It was a breach of the unspoken terms of their agreement. She had not been insolent. Her tone was matter-of-fact, her correction delivered with the precision of a scholar, not the challenge of a debater. And yet it was a challenge. It was a challenge to his assumptions, to the neat, simple box in which he had placed her. He dismissed the incident as an anomaly, a fragment of some forgotten finishing school lesson. He steered the conversation back to safer, more predictable ground. But the image of her calm, intelligent gaze remained with him long after he had retreated to the solitary comfort of his library. It was a week later that Eleanor discovered the precise dimensions of the cage he had built for her. She had been exploring the less frequented corridors of the manor, familiarizing herself with the geography of her new life. As she passed a service staircase near the west wing, she heard the voice of Mr. Hobbs, his tone low and instructive. He was speaking to a young footman. "The silver must be polished daily, Thomas, whether it has been used or not. The Duke notices everything. And you must remember His Grace's standing orders. The West Wing is his private domain. No staff are to enter the library suite unless expressly summoned." "Yes, Mr. Hobbs," the boy replied dutifully. "And that includes the Duchess," Hobbs added, his voice dropping even lower, as if imparting a state secret. His Grace's instructions from the very beginning were explicit. The Duchess is not to enter the library, under any circumstances. Is that understood? "Yes, Mr. Hobbs. Keep the Duchess out of the library." The words, stripped of all courtesy, struck Eleanor with the force of a physical blow. She froze in the shadows of the corridor, her hand flying to her throat. It was not the prohibition itself that wounded her. It was the cold, preemptive nature of it. He had not waited to see if she was a frivolous woman who might disturb his papers. He had not taken the measure of her character. He had simply assumed. He had judged her, condemned her as an intellectual nullity, and locked the door before she had even arrived. She was an intruder, a potential contaminant, a threat to be managed. She did not move until the sound of their footsteps had faded. She did not weep. Her heart did not race with anger. Instead, a profound and terrible calm settled over her. It was the calm of acceptance. She finally understood. He did not want a partner. He did not want a companion. He wanted a ghost in fine silks, a silent manager for his grand house, a vessel for his heir. Very well, a ghost he would have. She turned and walked back to the east wing, her posture perfect, her expression serene. A door had been locked to her, and in response, 1,000 doors within her quietly swung shut, bolted from the inside. The part of her that had corrected Professor Albright, the part that read Latin for pleasure, the part that found solace in the intricate beauty of a flower, all of it retreated deep inside, to a place where he could never find it, let alone bar it from entry. The change was not immediate. It was a gradual erosion. Alistair did not notice it at first, for he was not a man who paid close attention to the emotional weather of his household. He noticed that the household accounts were balanced to the penny. He noticed that his meals were always on time. He noticed that the estate ran with the silent, frictionless efficiency of a well-oiled machine. By all practical measures, his Duchess was a resounding success. But slowly, insidiously, a sense of absence began to permeate his existence. It began with the silence. The faint, melancholic strains of the pianoforte no longer drifted from the drawing room in the evenings. The instrument now stood perpetually closed, its keys gathering a fine layer of dust. When he inquired, Eleanor simply replied, "I have not felt inclined to play, Your Grace." Her voice was perfectly polite, perfectly empty. Then he noticed the flowers. Small, artful arrangements of wildflowers and interesting leaves had once appeared on the mantelpiece in his study or beside his breakfast setting. He had never acknowledged them, but he had, he realized, grown accustomed to their quiet presence. Now, there were only the formal, stiff bouquets ordered from the gardener, beautiful and utterly devoid of personality. At dinner, their conversations became a hollow ritual. He would ask about her day. She would provide a concise summary of her household duties. There were no more surprising corrections, no flashes of unexpected knowledge. She met his gaze, but her eyes were distant, as if she were looking at a point somewhere over his shoulder. He found himself talking more than usual, filling the unnerving void with observations on politics or estate matters. She would listen, nod, and murmur, "Indeed, Your Grace." He was a man speaking to an echo. He began to watch her more closely. He saw her walking in the gardens, her back straight, her pace measured. She no longer carried her sketchbook. She no longer knelt to examine a particular bloom. She was merely taking the air, performing the role of a lady of leisure. She was a figure in a landscape, beautiful and remote and utterly disconnected from it. The house grew quieter. The servants, taking their cue from their new mistress, moved with an almost preternatural stealth. The whole magnificent manor began to feel less like a home and more like a mausoleum. The order he had so prized was now absolute, and it was suffocating him. One evening, driven by a frustration he could not name, he sought out Mr. Hobbs in his pantry. "The Duchess seems unwell," Alistair began, feigning a casual concern. "She is very subdued." Hobbs paused in the act of polishing a silver salver, his movements economical and precise. He looked at the Duke, his expression perfectly neutral, yet his eyes held a depth of knowledge that Alistair found unsettling. "Not unwell, Your Grace," the butler said, his voice quiet but resonant in the small room. "Merely settled." "Settled?" Alistair repeated, frowning. "What is that supposed to mean?" Hobbs placed the salver down with a soft, definitive click. "A person finds their place in a new household, Your Grace. One learns the boundaries. One learns where one is welcome and where one is not. The words were impeccably respectful. They were also a perfectly aimed arrow. One learns where one is not welcome. The phrase followed him from the pantry, down the long, silent corridor to his library. He stood before the great oak doors, the words echoing in his mind. He had established a boundary. He had made it clear where she was not welcome. He remembered the crisp, dismissive tone of his own voice. She is not to enter the library, under any circumstances. He pushed the doors open and stepped inside. The room was exactly as he liked it. The books were perfectly aligned on their shelves, sentinels of leather and gilt. The air smelled of paper and polish and old leather. His papers were arranged in neat stacks on his desk. It was a temple of order and silence. And for the first time in his life, it felt utterly, profoundly empty. He walked through the towering aisles of books, trailing his fingers along their spines. Plato, Virgil, Newton, Copernicus. He had sought refuge here, in the company of great minds. He had believed this room contained the whole world, but now he felt its limitations. It was a world of ink and paper, a world of silent, dead men. He thought of Eleanor. He thought about her startling correction of Professor Albright. The knowledge had not come from a finishing school. It was too specific, too confident. It came from reading. It came from study. It came from a mind that was curious and alive. He thought about the silent pianoforte. He thought about the absent wildflowers. He thought about the look in her eyes at dinner, that polite, vacant stare that revealed nothing and concealed everything. An awful, sickening realization began to dawn on him. He had not married a blank canvas. He had married a vibrant, detailed, richly textured masterpiece, and he had, with his own arrogant, careless hands, hung it in a dark room and ordered the door to be locked. He had commanded his staff to keep her out of the one place in this entire house where she might have found a kindred spirit, if not in him, then in the pages of the books that surrounded him. He had wanted an unobtrusive duchess, a silent partner, and in his blindness, he had created one. He had systematically extinguished every spark of the real woman, leaving behind only the perfect, hollow shell of her duties. He had gotten exactly what he thought he wanted, and the reality of it was unbearable. He was the Duke of Blackwood. He was a master of logic, a man of intellect and precision, and he had just been confronted with the undeniable truth of his own colossal, catastrophic foolishness. The silence of the house was not her failure. It was his. It was the sound of a vibrant mind being starved of oxygen. It was the sound of a quiet heart breaking in a way that was too dignified to make a fuss. He had to find her. He did not know where to look. She was no longer in the drawing room, or the music room, or the gardens. She had retreated to a place he could not map. He strode through the house, his urgency a stark contrast to the funereal calm that surrounded him. He finally found her in a place he had not known existed, a small, forgotten glass house at the farthest end of the kitchen garden. It was a dilapidated structure, with several panes of glass cracked and a century of grime dulling the light. But inside, she had created a world. Pots of seedlings were arranged on a makeshift trestle table. Her botanical sketches, detailed and exquisite, were pinned to a wooden frame. And on a small, rickety stool sat her few precious books, a tiny, defiant library in exile. She was standing at the table, carefully transplanting a tiny fern, her fingers deft and gentle. She did not look up as he entered, though he knew she had heard him. The air was thick with the scent of damp earth and growing things. It felt more alive than any room in the grand manor. He stopped at the threshold, suddenly at a loss. The ducal authority he wore like a second skin was useless here. He was the intruder in her sanctuary, a place she had been forced to create because he had denied her access to his. "Eleanor," he said. Her name felt foreign on his tongue. He had always called her Your Grace. She continued her work, her focus absolute. "Your Grace," she replied, her voice level, devoid of any emotion. He took a step into the room, the sound of his boots crunching on the gravel floor. I came to tell you." He faltered. The words were simple, yet they felt like stones in his throat. He, who could debate political philosophy for hours, could not form a simple sentence of apology. He tried again, forcing the words out. "I was wrong." Her hands stilled. For the first time, she looked at him. Her eyes were not angry or sad or triumphant. They were simply watchful, waiting. He gestured vaguely, helplessly, around the small glass house. "This. Your books. The conversation at dinner with Albright. I made an assumption before you even arrived. I viewed this marriage as a transaction, and I viewed you as a term of the contract, a function to be performed." The confession was brutal, laying bare the full depth of his arrogance. "I wanted my life to remain undisturbed. I cherished my solitude, my work. I saw you as a potential disruption to that." He took another step closer. "The order I gave to Mr. Hobbs about the library, it was not born of malice. It was born of a profound, inexcusable ignorance, my own. I did not see you. I did not even try to see you. I barred you from a room, but in doing so, I barred myself from knowing the woman I had married." He looked from her face to the silent house beyond the dirty glass. "I have come to detest the quiet. I miss the sound of the pianoforte. I miss the woman who knew more about botany than Professor Albright and was not afraid to say so. I have spent the last month living with the perfect, unobtrusive Duchess I thought I wanted, and I have discovered that she is a stranger to me, and I am desperate to meet my wife." He had said more than he had intended. He had revealed more of himself than he was comfortable with. He stood before her, stripped of his ducal arrogance, feeling raw and exposed. Eleanor looked at him for a long moment, her gaze searching his. She saw not a duke, but a man finally awakening from a long, self-imposed slumber. She saw the flicker of genuine remorse in his eyes. She picked up a small cloth and meticulously wiped the soil from her hands. He took it as a dismissal, a final, quiet rejection, but then he saw her reach for his hand. She did not take it. Instead, she turned it over and placed a single, perfect fern frond in his palm. It was a delicate, intricate thing, a world of complexity in miniature. He did not understand. "It's an adiantum," she said, her voice soft but clear. "A maidenhair fern. They are notoriously difficult to cultivate. They require a very specific balance of light, humidity, and shelter. They cannot be commanded to grow. They must be understood." He closed his hand around the delicate frond. He understood now. It was not a rejection. It was a lesson. It was a challenge. "Come with me," he said, his voice hoarse. She hesitated for only a second before giving a slight nod. He did not take her hand, sensing it would be a presumption. He simply turned and led the way back to the house, acutely aware of her quiet footsteps behind him. He did not lead her to her suite in the East Wing. He led her down the long, imposing corridor of the West Wing, to the great oak doors of the library. He stopped before them and turned to face her. "I am a fool, Eleanor. I have filled this room with the wisdom of the ages, and yet I possessed none myself." He reached for the heavy iron handle, the metal cool beneath his fingers. He pushed the door open, revealing the soaring shelves, the scent of leather and paper, the cathedral of knowledge he had guarded so jealously. He stood aside. "This is not my library," he said, his voice resonating with a conviction that came from the very core of his being. "From this moment, it is ours." Eleanor paused on the threshold. She looked past him, into the heart of the room that had been forbidden to her. It was more magnificent than she could have imagined. But it was not the books that held her attention. It was the man standing beside the door, his face etched with a sincerity she could not doubt. He had not just opened a door, he had surrendered a fortress. He had admitted his defeat. He had asked for a new beginning. She took a single step, and then another, crossing the threshold from her exile into the heart of his world. Her entry into the library did not magically erase the hurt. Trust, she knew, was a far more delicate thing than a fern, and much harder to cultivate. She accepted his gesture, but a part of her remained watchful, reserved. She would not be so easily won. Words were wind. Actions were the soil in which change might grow. Alistair seemed to understand this. He did not press her. He did not crowd her. He gave her the space she needed, but it was a different kind of space now. Not the space of separation, but the space of invitation. He began a quiet, determined campaign, not of courtship, but of observation. He was learning to see. He would find her in the library in the early mornings, a folio of botanical prints spread before her. Instead of retreating to his own desk, he would bring his coffee and sit opposite her, asking quiet questions. Why is the venation on that leaf different from this one? What did Linnaeus get wrong? He did not feign interest. He cultivated it. He listened, truly listened, as she explained the intricate logic of the natural world, her voice losing its guarded flatness and regaining the quiet passion he had heard only once before. One afternoon, he returned from a trip to London and presented her not with jewelry or gowns, but with a heavy, leather-bound book. It was a first edition of Bartram's Travels, the very source she had cited against Professor Albright. Her fingers traced the gilded title, and for the first time in months, he saw a genuine, unguarded smile touch her lips. It was a small, fleeting thing, but it felt like the sun breaking through clouds. He started to share his own work with her. He was translating Thucydides' History of the Peloponnesian War, a project he had guarded jealously for years. One evening, he brought a difficult passage to her. "I am struggling with the nuance of this phrase," he admitted, a confession of vulnerability that would have been unthinkable to him 2 months prior. "The Athenian envoy's speech at Sparta. What do you make of it?" She read the Greek text, her brow furrowed in concentration. She did not offer a simple translation. She offered an interpretation, discussing the political subtext, the subtle shifts in rhetoric, the way Thucydides used a single word to convey both a threat and a plea. They debated the passage for an hour, their heads bent together over the ancient text, the firelight flickering on the spines of the books that surrounded them. In that moment, they were not a duke and his duchess. They were 2 minds meeting, equals in a shared pursuit of understanding. The household began to breathe again. The pianoforte remained silent, but now there was the sound of pages turning in the library, the low murmur of conversation, the occasional shared laugh that echoed startlingly in the quiet halls. Mr. Hobbs observed it all with a discreet satisfaction, ensuring that a fresh pot of tea was always at hand for the scholars in the library. The true test came during a weekend party hosted at Blackwood. It was their first time entertaining as a couple, and the county society descended upon them, eager to take the measure of the Duke's quiet new bride. Among the guests was Lord Ashworth, a man whose wit was exceeded only by his malice. Alistair had long tolerated him as a necessary evil of their social circle. At dinner on the second night, Ashworth, flushed with wine, turned his attention to Eleanor. "Your Grace," he said, his voice carrying across the table, "we are all so terribly impressed with how you have taken to your duties. Blackwood has never been so orderly. The Duke must be commended on his choice. Such a sensible, practical wife, not one of these flighty literary ladies who are always scribbling dreadful poetry." The insult was veiled, but its target was clear. It was a dismissal of her as a person, a reduction of her to a mere function. The table fell into an expectant hush. In the past, Alistair would have ignored the comment, letting it pass as inconsequential banter, but he was not the man he had been. He placed his wineglass down with a deliberate, resonant click. The sound cut through the silence. He turned his cool, analytical gaze upon Lord Ashworth. "You are mistaken, Ashworth," he said, his voice quiet but carrying an unmistakable edge of steel. "My wife is indeed a sensible and practical duchess. She is also the most formidable scholar I have ever had the pleasure of knowing." He looked down the table at Eleanor, his expression softening. "In fact, her insights into Thucydides have been invaluable to my current work. Her understanding of classical Greek is, I have discovered, rather more precise than my own." He then turned his gaze back to the stunned lord. "So you see, I find myself in the uniquely fortunate position of having a wife who can not only manage an estate, but can also correct my translations. I am to be envied, not commended." He raised his glass to Eleanor. "To the Duchess." The entire table, flustered and eager to follow the Duke's lead, raised their glasses. "To the Duchess!" Ashworth, his face a mask of mortified fury, had no choice but to join them. It was a public defense, a clear and unequivocal declaration of her value, not just as a duchess, but as his intellectual and personal equal. Later that night, after their guests had retired, they stood together in the library. The fire had burned down to glowing embers, casting long shadows across the room. The air was still charged with the aftermath of the confrontation. "Thank you," Eleanor said softly, her back to him as she gazed into the fire. Alistair came to stand beside her. "He is a fool. I am the greater one for having tolerated him for so long." He looked at her profile, the strong, intelligent line of her jaw illuminated by the dying flames. "And for having been so blind myself." He reached out and took her hand. This time, she did not pull away. Her fingers curled around his. "Alistair," he said, the name a quiet offering. "My name is Alistair." "I know," she whispered. "My life," he began, struggling to articulate the profound shift that had occurred within him. "Before you came, it was legible. It was a perfectly transcribed text. Every word was in its place. It was orderly, and it was clear, but it had no meaning." He tightened his grip on her hand. "You have taught me how to read between the lines. You have brought meaning to the text, Eleanor. You have brought life to the house. You have brought life to me." He turned to face her fully, his other hand coming up to gently cup her cheek. "I did not understand what love was. I thought it was a poetic indulgence, an inefficient and illogical emotion. I was wrong about that too. I love you. Not because you are my duchess, not because you are the mother of my future heir, but because you are you. The woman who sketches ferns and translates Greek and knows the truth about solitary bees. I love you. Tears welled in Eleanor's eyes, but they were not tears of sorrow. They were tears of release, of a long-held breath finally being let go. She looked at the man before her, the man who had once been a stranger and was now the most familiar landscape she knew. She saw the truth of his words in the earnest, open expression on his face. A small, wry smile touched her lips. "Well," she said, her voice thick with emotion but laced with her old, dry wit. "It certainly took you long enough to see it." He laughed, a real, unburdened sound, and then he leaned down and kissed her, not with the formal restraint of their wedding day, but with all the pent-up longing and newfound wonder of a man who had finally learned how to read the heart of the woman he loved. A year later, the library at Blackwood Manor was a different place. Sunlight streamed through the tall, arched windows, illuminating the dust motes dancing in the air. The scent of leather and old paper was now mingled with the faint, sweet perfume of lemon verbena from a vase on the mantelpiece. Books were no longer confined to the shelves. They lay open, on tables, on chairs, on the floor, a testament to a space that was not just revered, but lived in. Alistair sat at the large central table, ostensibly working on his Thucydides, but his attention was elsewhere. He was watching his wife. Eleanor was curled in a large wing-back chair by the window, a heavy volume resting on her burgeoning belly. Their first child was due in the spring. She was reading, a small, contented smile playing on her lips as her fingers gently traced the lines of text. He marveled at the change in her, in himself, in the very atmosphere of the house. The oppressive silence had been replaced by a comfortable, companionable quiet, punctuated by the rustle of pages and the murmur of shared thoughts. The ghost he had tried to create had vanished, replaced by this vibrant, brilliant woman who was his partner in every sense of the word. The dilapidated glass house at the edge of the garden had been fully restored. Under Eleanor's direction, it had become a marvel of botanical science, a flourishing testament to her passion and knowledge. It was no longer a place of exile, but a shared project, a symbol of the life they were cultivating together. He remembered his first, foolish command to Mr. Hobbs. Keep her out of the library. How absurd it seemed now, how breathtakingly ignorant. He had thought he was protecting his world, when, in fact, he had been locking out its most essential part. He hadn't needed to keep her out. He had needed, desperately, to find her here. Eleanor looked up, as if sensing his gaze. Her smile widened. "What are you thinking about?" she asked. He put down his pen and went to her, kneeling by her chair. He placed a hand on her belly, feeling the faint, fluttering movement of the new life within. "I was thinking," he said, his voice low and filled with a quiet reverence, "that for a man who owned 10,000 books, I was remarkably illiterate." He leaned in and kissed her, a slow, deep kiss filled with the comfortable certainty of a love that had been hard-won and was now deeply cherished. He had finally learned that the greatest knowledge was not to be found in the pages of a book, but in the heart of another person. If only one had the wisdom to stop and look, and truly, finally, see. If you made it to the end of this story, thank you for listening. The Duke's initial demand was rather harsh, born of arrogance and fear. So let me ask you, If you were in Eleanor's position and could set one condition for allowing him back into your life, what would it have been? Tell me in the comments below. If you enjoyed this story, please consider liking this video and subscribing to the channel for more tales of love, loss, and the slow, beautiful journey of learning to see what's been there all along. Our next story is Waiting. It involves a reclusive marquess with a shadowed past, a determined cartographer hired to map his wild estate, and a secret garden that holds the key to both their hearts. They arrive here, whenever they are ready,